The fluorescent lights in that conference room made everyone look a little sick. Maybe that was fitting. I sat at one end of the long oak table with my hands in my lap, fingers laced together so tight my knuckles had gone pale. My brother sat at the other end. He had his jacket on, the charcoal one he always wore when he wanted to look like the reasonable one. He was smiling at the mediator the way he smiled everyone who didn't know him yet. Patient. Warm. Like a man who had nothing to hide and everything to offer. I had learned a long time ago that my brother's smile was the thing you needed to be most afraid of. His name is Daniel. He is 4 years older than me, and for most of my life, I believe that made him wiser. Our father died on a Tuesday in November, 3 weeks after his 67th birthday. Pancreatic cancer. By the time they found it, there wasn't much left to do except sit with him. I flew home from Fort Bragg on emergency leave, still in my ACUs, and drove straight from the airport to the hospital. My father was awake when I got there. He looked at me standing in the doorway and said, "Nina, you came." Like he had ever doubted I would. I held his hand for 6 days. Daniel came on day 2 and stayed for about 40 minutes. He said he had a situation with a client that couldn't wait. He kissed my father on the forehead, promised he'd be back on the weekend, and then he left. He didn't come back until the day before my father died, when the nurses had already told us it would be soon. I noticed it then, the way Daniel looked around the room when he came in. Not at my father's face, at the furniture, at the side table with the family photos, at the closet where my father kept his important documents in a locked box that we all knew about. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself grief made people strange. I told myself a lot of things back then. My father had been a structural engineer. He built his business from scratch, starting in a one-room office in Charlotte, North Carolina, spending 30 years growing it into something real. He also owned the house I grew up in, a 4-bedroom colonial in Concord with a wraparound porch and a backyard that backed up to the woods. He had paid it off entirely by the time I was in high school. He was proud of that. He mentioned it sometimes with this quiet satisfaction, like a man checking something off a list he'd been working on his whole life. In his will, he left the house to both me and Daniel equally. That's where the trouble started. Or that's where I thought it started. I found out later it had started much earlier than that. 6 weeks after the funeral, Daniel called me. I was back at Fort Bragg by then, back to work, trying to hold myself together the way soldiers do. By staying busy, by having a mission, by not allowing yourself to stop long enough to feel the full weight of what you've lost. He said he wanted to talk about the house. I said okay. He said he thought it made more sense for one of us to buy the other out, rather than try to manage a shared property long distance. He said the market was good right now. He said he had a real estate contact who could get us a fair appraisal. I said that sounded reasonable. I said I'd look into it when I had some leave saved up. He said, actually, time was a factor. There were carrying costs, property taxes, insurance, utilities. He said it was a burden on both of us to let it sit vacant. He said his real estate contact could move quickly if we wanted to avoid the complications. I said, Daniel, I just got back. Can we talk about this in a month? He said, of course. He said, take your time. He said he was just thinking of us both. That was the last normal conversation we had. I grew up knowing I was different from Daniel in the way that some siblings just are. Not better, not worse, just cut from different cloth. Daniel was always the one who wanted to be seen. Student council, debate team. The kind of kid who showed up to every school event because he liked the way rooms turned toward him when he walked in. I was quieter. I liked being outdoors. I liked problems that had solutions. I liked the feeling of having done something hard. When I told my parents I wanted to enlist after college, my mother cried. My father sat with it for a week and then told me he respected my decision and he was proud of me. Daniel thought it was the strangest thing I had ever done. He kept asking, but why? Like there had to be an explanation that made more sense than the real one, which was simply that it felt right to me in a way that almost nothing else had. I went to officer candidate school. I commissioned as a second lieutenant. I deployed twice, once to Kuwait, once to Germany for a joint training mission that extended longer than expected. I came home different both times. older in places that had nothing to do with age. The army taught me to assess a situation before I acted. It taught me to keep my reactions close to my chest. It taught me that the person talking the most in the room is almost never the most dangerous one in it. Those lessons saved me. I didn't know it yet, but they were going to save me. About 2 months after that phone call with Daniel, I got a letter from a law firm in Charlotte. It was not a friendly letter. It informed me that my brother had filed a petition in Cabarrus County Probate Court to have my father's will contested. His argument, as the letter laid it out, was that our father had not been of sound mind when he signed the final version of the will, the version that divided the property equally between us. Daniel claimed there was an earlier version that left the house to him alone, and that my father had been manipulated into changing it. By me. The letter said my brother was seeking full ownership of the property, plus reimbursement for what he called estate management costs he had allegedly been covering since our father's death. I sat in my apartment and read that letter 3 times. Then I called my father's attorney. She told me she had drafted the will herself. She told me there was no earlier version leaving the house solely to Daniel. She told me she had witnessed my father sign the document and that he had been completely lucid. She said she was sorry I was dealing with this and that she would help however she could. I said thank you. I hung up the phone. I did not cry. I put the letter in a folder. I made a cup of coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what my father would have done. He would have started a file. He would have documented everything. He would have moved carefully and spoken little and waited for the right moment. So that's what I did. What I didn't know then, what I spent the next 4 months piecing together, was that Daniel had been planning this before our father was even gone. My father had a neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door for 20 years and who had known our family since Daniel and I were in middle school. She called me about 3 months into the legal process. She said she didn't know if this was her place to say anything, but she felt like she had to. She said she had seen Daniel at the house twice while our father was still in the hospital, the last 2 weeks, when Dad was barely conscious. She said Daniel had a truck. She said the truck left with things in it both times. I thanked her. I wrote it down. I added it to the file. Then I called the estate attorney again and asked if she could walk me through exactly what was supposed to be in the house versus what was actually still there when the estate inventory was conducted. She sent me the inventory list. I cross-referenced it with photos I had taken when I was home for the funeral, photos I had taken almost without thinking, because I always documented things. That was just how my brain worked. 3 items on the inventory list were missing: a watch that had belonged to my grandfather, a set of signed lithographs my father had collected over 30 years, and a lockbox. The lockbox that had held my father's important documents. I want to be honest about what those months were like, because I think people don't always say it out loud. I was afraid, not in the way I had been afraid downrange. That fear was clean and immediate. It had an object. It was something you could respond to. This fear was murkier. It lived in my chest like a weight I couldn't put down. It was the fear of being disbelieved, of being seen as the difficult one, of having done everything right and still losing. People at work noticed I wasn't sleeping well. My unit's JAG officer, who I'd gotten to know through a case that had nothing to do with mine, sat across from me one afternoon in the break room and said, "Meena, you look like someone who's carrying something alone." I said I was fine. She said okay. Then she slid a card across the table, a civilian attorney she knew who handled inheritance disputes. She said she was just putting it there. She said I didn't have to do anything with it. I picked it up. The attorney I eventually hired was a woman who had been practicing estate law in North Carolina for 22 years. She had short gray hair and an office full of succulents and the kind of stillness that made you feel like she had heard every story and was not going to be rattled by yours. I told her everything. I showed her the file I had built. She went through it slowly, page by page, and when she was done, she looked up at me and said, "Your brother made a significant number of mistakes." That was the first moment I let myself exhale. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in March, 8 months after my father died. I took leave. I drove down to Charlotte the night before and stayed at a hotel 10 minutes from the courthouse. I didn't sleep much. I lay in the dark and went over everything in my head the way you go over a mission brief. The sequence of events, the likely complications, the contingencies. My attorney had told me to let her do most of the talking. She said my job was to sit still and look like I had nothing to prove. That was harder than it sounds. Daniel was already in the courtroom when I arrived. He had a lawyer too, a man in an expensive suit who shook hands with everyone and laughed too easily. Daniel himself was wearing the charcoal jacket again. When I walked in, he looked at me across the room with an expression that I can only describe as pity. Like I was someone who didn't understand what was about to happen to them. I sat down. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at the front of the room. The hearing began. Daniel's attorney went first. He presented what he called a copy of the earlier will, the one that left the house to Daniel alone. He presented bank records that he said showed my father's declining cognition in his last year. He presented a letter, allegedly written by a physician, suggesting my father had experienced episodes of confusion. My attorney objected to the physician's letter. The judge noted the objection and set it aside for the moment. Then Daniel's attorney said something that I had not expected. He told the judge that in addition to the will dispute, there was a matter of concern regarding my fitness as a co-heir. He said that in recent months I had exhibited erratic behavior. He said I had been making harassing phone calls to the neighbor, to Mrs. Patterson. He said I had been showing up at the property without notice. He said there were people close to the family who had expressed concern about my mental state. I kept my hands still. I kept my face still. I looked at the judge. My attorney leaned over and whispered, "Don't react." I didn't. The judge asked Daniel's attorney to substantiate these claims. He produced a signed statement. A statement, he said, from a neighbor of the property, corroborating his concerns about my behavior. I felt something cold move through me. I glanced at my attorney. She was already writing something on a legal pad. She did not look worried. That was the only thing keeping me in my chair. I need to explain what happened next because I want to be accurate about it. My attorney stood up. She said she would like to present several items for the court's consideration. The first was an affidavit from my father's estate attorney, who had drafted the will and witnessed its signing, stating that there was no prior version of the document and that my father had been entirely competent at the time of signing. The second was a report from a document examiner, an expert who had spent 30 years analyzing handwriting and printed documents for courts, stating that the earlier will Daniel's attorney had presented contained formatting inconsistencies consistent with digital fabrication. The third was a phone carrier record showing that the calls Daniel's attorney had categorized as harassing were calls made to Mrs. Patterson by a number registered to Daniel himself. The fourth was a video. It was not high-quality footage. It was security camera footage from a neighbor 2 houses down who had a camera mounted on his garage that covered the street. It showed my father's driveway on 2 separate dates during the final weeks of his hospitalization. It showed a truck. It showed boxes being loaded. It showed my brother. The fifth item my attorney presented was a statement from Mrs. Patterson herself. Not the statement Daniel's team had supposedly obtained from her. Her actual statement, recorded by a notary the week prior, in which she described what she had seen, described being contacted by someone claiming to be a legal representative who had pressured her to sign a document she didn't fully understand, and stated that she had subsequently refused, and that any document bearing her name in these proceedings was not something she had knowingly or willingly signed. The courtroom was very quiet. Daniel's attorney asked for a brief recess. The judge said no. I have thought a lot about what my brother's face looked like in that moment. I have tried to find the right word for it. It wasn't panic exactly. It was more like the expression of someone who has been walking across ice they were certain would hold and has just heard the first crack. The judge reviewed the materials. She asked Daniel's attorney several pointed questions. His answers became shorter. At one point, he asked again for a recess. The judge said she would take a 15-minute break and come back to the bench. During those 15 minutes, I sat in the hallway on the wooden bench outside the courtroom with my attorney beside me. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. I looked at my hands in my lap and thought about my father, about the way he used to sit on the porch on summer evenings with a glass of iced tea, watching the light go orange through the trees in the backyard, about how he had said once, when I was about 12 and upset over something I can no longer remember, "Nina, the people who try to take what isn't theirs always have to carry the weight of what they've done. You just have to be patient enough to let them get tired." I had not understood what he meant then. I understood it now. When we went back inside, the judge spoke for about 8 minutes. She found no merit in the challenge to the original will. She found a document submitted as an earlier will to be of questionable authenticity and referred it to the county DA's office for review. She found the statement, allegedly from Mrs. Patterson, to be inadmissible and flagged the circumstances of its procurement as a matter of potential concern. She ordered the estate to proceed according to the original and lawful will. She also noted for the record that the items missing from the estate inventory, the watch, the lithographs, the lockbox, had not been accounted for, and that this matter was being referred accordingly. My brother left the courtroom without looking at me. His attorney looked like a man who had just realized the ice he'd been standing on had broken an hour ago, and he simply hadn't noticed yet. The drive home that night, back to the hotel, because I was too tired to drive all the way back to Fort Bragg. I stopped at a diner off I-85 and ate breakfast food at 9 o'clock at night, because that is what you do when you have been running on adrenaline and very little sleep. I got scrambled eggs and wheat toast and bad coffee, and I sat in a booth by the window and watched the headlights pass on the highway, and I let myself feel it. All of it. The grief that had been parked behind the urgency of the past 8 months. The anger. The relief. The sadness that this was what it had come to, that the family I had grown up in had collapsed into something I no longer recognized. I thought about my father's watch. It had belonged to his father before him, a simple pullover with a scratched crystal and a worn leather band. My father wore it every day until his hands got too swollen from the illness for it to fit anymore. He had shown it to me when I was little, turned it over so I could see the engraving on the back. For the miles ahead, he said his father had given it to him the day he left for his first job out of college. I don't know if I'll ever get it back. The legal process around the missing items is still ongoing. There are no guarantees, but I know what it means. And I think wherever he is, my father knows too. People ask me sometimes, colleagues, friends who followed bits and pieces of what happened, how I kept it together during all of it, how I didn't fall apart. I want to be honest about that too. I did fall apart, just not publicly. There were nights in my apartment when I sat on the bathroom floor and cried until I couldn't anymore. There were weeks when I went through the motions at work like a person running on reserve power, doing the job, checking the boxes, and feeling nothing except the low, persistent hum of dread. What kept me functional was the work itself, having the file, having something to do with my hands and my mind instead of just sitting inside the pain of it, documenting, organizing, preparing. Those things gave me a structure when everything else had lost its shape. And there were people. The JAG officer who slid that card across the table. Mrs. Patterson, who picked up the phone and told the truth even when someone had tried to use her against me. My attorney, who looked at my folder and told me I had done the right things. A friend from OCS who texted me every Sunday morning for 6 months with nothing except a check-in. How are you holding up? And who never made me feel like I was supposed to be over it. Family is not always the people who share your last name. That's something I knew intellectually before all of this. I know it in my bones now. The house is being sold. We agreed to that, both of us entitled to our share for the will. Daniel is handling nothing. The estate attorney is managing the process. I will receive what my father intended for me to have. I don't live in Charlotte. I'm not sure I'll go back often. Too many layers now to the geography of that city. Too many streets that lead somewhere I don't want to revisit. But there is a corner of the backyard, right where the lawn meets the tree line, where my father used to keep a wooden bench he'd built himself from reclaimed lumber. He would sit there on weekend mornings before anyone else was awake. I used to come downstairs and find him there sometimes, just sitting, coffee in hand, watching the woods. I went there the weekend after the hearing. I drove out before the real estate agent's lockbox went on the door. I let myself in with the key I still had. I walked through the house, through the rooms that smelled like him, past the walls where his pictures had hung, across the kitchen floor that had always creaked in the same spot near the sink. And I went out the back door and I sat on that bench for a while. I didn't stay long. There wasn't a reason to. But I wanted to sit there once more. I wanted to feel what it felt like to be in the place where he had sat, in the quiet before the day began, before everything got complicated. It felt like him. Just for a minute, that was enough. My name is Nina. I served 8 years in the United States Army, and I came home to find that the person I had trusted to hold our family together while I was away had been quietly working to take everything our father had built. He almost got away with it. He didn't. I have a lot of feelings about all of it. About the brother I thought I knew. About the months of fear and documentation and court dates. About a wooden bench in the corner of a yard I'm about to lose my legal right to enter. I'm still sorting through all of them. But I know this much. My father spent his life building something honest. He worked with his hands and his mind, and he did not cut corners. And he did not take what wasn't his. He passed that down to me even when I didn't know I was receiving it. That's the inheritance that mattered. The rest was just a house. I've thought about cause and effect a lot since all of this ended. Not in any grand philosophical way, just in the plain ordinary way you think about it when you're sitting in a diner at 9 at night eating scrambled eggs and trying to understand how your family fell apart. Here's what I keep coming back to. Daniel didn't become the person he showed himself to be in that courtroom overnight. He was always that person. I just wasn't looking. Or maybe I was looking and choosing not to see the way you do with family because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. The erosion happened slowly. In small choices he made over years, each one a little easier than the last because the previous one had gone unpunished. That's how it works. Not a single dramatic moment of corruption, but a long, quiet accumulation of small surrenders to the worst version of yourself. And my father saw it. I think he saw it and didn't know what to do with what he saw. So he did what a lot of parents do. He hoped. He hoped that the right circumstances would bring out something better. He structured his will the way he did because he believed in equal treatment even when equal treatment wasn't earned. That was his goodness. It was also, in a way, what created the opening Daniel walked through. I don't say that to blame my father. I say it because I think it matters that goodness without clear-eyed judgment can sometimes leave the door open for people who have no intention of being good in return. Integrity without discernment is not enough. You have to also see people as they actually are, not as you wish they were. What saved me was documentation. It sounds almost mundane when I put it that way. Not courage, not a dramatic confrontation, not a moment of inspired brilliance, just the habit of writing things down, of keeping records, of treating every interaction like it might matter later. That is a form of intelligence, I think. Practical intelligence, the kind that doesn't announce itself but quietly builds the structure that holds everything up when things get difficult. And the resilience that came from learning to stay functional inside discomfort. The army taught me a version of that, but honestly, the deepest version came from those 8 months of being afraid and doing the work anyway, of crying on a bathroom floor and then getting up and updating the file, of not knowing if I would win and deciding that doing things right mattered regardless of the outcome. That's what resilience actually is, I think. Not the absence of falling apart, it's the decision to keep going even while you're falling apart. Daniel made choices. Each one narrowed the path available to him until there was nowhere left to go except straight into the consequences of his own making. I didn't do that to him. The judge didn't do that to him. Mrs. Patterson didn't do that to him. He did it one decision at a time over years. My father left me more than a house. He left me the way he lived, honestly, carefully, without taking shortcuts. That turned out to be the only inheritance that actually protected me. I'm still his daughter. That's the path no one can forge, contest, or take away.